Okay. Good evening, everybody. I am here with Vanessa Weichberger. My name is Laurent, and I am going to interview her tonight with a few questions. Does that sound good to you?
Sounds great.
Okay. So, I first met Vanessa in 1990 at Mehrabad, India, at Baba's home in, I guess I met you at the Pilgrim Center there. That's a whole nother story. But let's go back earlier to before you got to Mehrabad. Let's talk about your early life and the period before Meher Baba. There was a short period of your life, I think, before Meher Baba, and then we'll talk about how Meher Baba came into your life. But give us a little background. What was life like before Meher Baba came into the world for your family? Where were you and what was going on at that time before Baba?
I don't really have that much memory of before Baba. My parents came to Baba in the early 70s, and I was born in 1970. So I think by the time I was about 2, we had already framed photographs of Baba on our living room wall and in our kitchen, and then later my parents went to India for the first time in 1976. So when they came back from India, we had posters saying "Don't worry, be happy" of Baba on our bedroom walls, and we had gifts from the women Mandali of bangles and dolls with the saris on them, and I just remember looking at the photographs of Baba on the wall and never questioning that was anybody other than God.
And how old were you in 76?
I was 6.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, before I was 6, I was still seeing these photographs, and to me it felt natural, and it felt good. And my parents never really spoke a lot in those early years about Baba. I think they were, you know, going through that transition because they were seekers. You know, both my parents were into Buddhism. I think my father at some point, you know, right before my mother became pregnant with me, he was ready to join a monastery. And then those plans were kind of thrown out when, you know, my mom got pregnant. But we, you know, both my parents were hippies, but they did not do drugs because they had, you know, met when they were 19 and 21, so they were very young. So really by the time they were, you know, still in their early 20s, they had found Baba, and they had taken seriously that, you know, he said no drugs. And they really wanted to know if he was the real deal. And so they, you know, would save up all their money and drive the VW down to LA, you know, to find someone or a bookstore that had information about Baba. And eventually we found a group of Sufis who were showing films of Baba. So once a month we would drive down as kids, and this is before, you know, my parents went to India, and we would watch films of Baba. And I always remember just having that feeling of feeling loved by him. Like, it wasn't obviously anything that my parents had told me, because they weren't really talking that much about Baba. They were just taking us to see the films, or, you know, we were just sort of participating in their journey, but not, they weren't preaching to us or anything. And I think, you know, with everyone though, I think we all have that moment where our master creates a moment, in other words, in our lives where we really decide for ourselves, like, this person is my master. I mean, just because I grew up with Baba's photographs and I felt, you know, a connection to him, wasn't enough. Like, there was a point in my life later on when I was a teenager where, he was asking me whether I wanted to take him as, my master.
So that kind of is a segue to another question I had. It's a double pointed question. One is, when's the first time you remember feeling consciously Mayor Baba's love for you? And the caveat is, when is the first time you remember consciously feeling your love for Baba? I think they're different, maybe.
I think the younger ages, I remember recognizing him through the photograph. When my parents came back from India and handed me the gifts that Mara and the other women had put together for us
In 76.
in 1976, I tangibly felt his love in those gifts. And while my parents were in India, I had my first experience of bliss. That being that I was 6 and I hadn't really been exposed to spiritual teachings per se or spiritual vocabulary, I didn't understand that the word would be bliss. So I told my babysitter that I felt like an angel. And I remember feeling joy in my heart that was so beautiful and intense that, I was kind of transported, what I felt like was into being an angel. And then I heard later, much later, when I could understand a little bit more, that when any one of your family goes to India, that your whole family energetically goes. Like, everybody gets the benefit. So I felt that that's what had happened, that, my parents had gone and I was getting, the love directly from Baba through them. And then, and then I remember consciously feeling love. Okay, well, when my parents went to India, that was a big defining moment for me, because that's when I realized I had a very deep connection to Baba that was beyond my parents. It was beyond the pictures on the wall. I had a sense of desperation, and what kind of 6-year-old feels a sense of desperation, and why? But my desperation was I needed to go to India with them, and I knew I would be missing out if I didn't go, and I was adamant about telling them that I needed to come on this trip, which I did, but they explained to me that you had to be 7 in order to go, that the rule then was to protect people from their kids getting sick or this or that, and so they could focus on being there with Baba.
So let's talk about that. So it was, I know because I was there, many years later that you actually first went to Mehrabad in India. Mm-hmm. How old were you when you actually ended up there?
So I didn't actually end up going to India until 1990 when I met you, and I was 19 at the time. So that was quite a long time from my introduction, right, which is the photographs on the wall, when I could first consciously take those in, maybe, that toddler stage, to being really almost an adult. And
how was that? So did you meet Baba's close disciples? We call them Mandali. And who did you feel a connection to during that trip, the first trip?
So I think before I start with my connections to who I felt close to on that trip, I have to say that Mara had passed away shortly before I was to leave on that trip, and we were just trying to get our passports in line for the trip. And I remember I was in college and I was living in an apartment, and my mom called me to let me know that Mara had dropped her body. And now I had never met Mara. I mean, Mara had given me gifts, but I had never had any interaction with her through letters or anything. But when my mother told me that, without even having a thought, I began sobbing. And I was devastated that I didn't get to meet, Mara, and that she had passed before I could go. So I think I definitely had a deep connection to Mara, but I don't think it was through this life. And then when I arrived, the moment the plane landed and I stepped off the plane, I knew that India was my home. I knew it felt so familiar, and it felt like, you know, like coming home. That's the only way I can explain it. And then, of course, getting to Mehrabad, Baba's love is so fulfilling and palpable that I just felt, again, like I was coming to the place that I've always longed to be at but never knew existed until I had that experience.
And so which of the disciples do you remember most vividly and clearly as connections, resonance, like you felt them? I mean, there's so many of Baba's disciples, right? There's countless disciples of Baba, but some most likely stand out more than others.
Well, okay, so meeting, some of the core disciples that, of course, by the time I was 19, we got to read stories of, and we had children's books to read about some of the Mandali's, stories and tales. And so I knew of Mani, and I knew of Erich, and Bao would come to visit, and a lot of these Mandali would come to LA where I was living, and we would have a Sahavas every year. So I did get to meet them at these yearly gatherings. And so I would say that I was more familiar with Bao, Katie. I don't remember meeting Adi, but I know he came because I was very young.
Yeah.
But when I got there to India, when you go to the porch, it's Mani, Erich, Arnavaz, Erich's brother. They all stand there and they embrace you.
Mm-hmm.
And each one of them has their own, fragrance, and I was just blown away with how loving they were and how much love I felt from each one of them, and how much acceptance, and that they were inviting me into their very own home, but it was as if I was their dearest brother or sister.
Yeah. So then, of course, Baba would say that pilgrimage is wonderful and he wanted us to visit his home. And then he would also tell people while he was alive, he would say, go straight back home, don't go sightseeing, don't see other saints and masters, go straight back home and take me with you. Mm-hmm. And he wanted us, my understanding is, he wanted us to not only take him with us, but I would say internalize him, like make him, he would say, make me your constant companion, and think of me more than you think of yourself. And he said so many things, but from that initial time at Mehrabad in 1990 till now, which is now 30 years later, what does internalizing Baba, making him your constant companion, being on the spiritual path, what does that mean to you? What is that about? Because it's more than just words, right? What does it mean to walk with Baba on a spiritual path?
Well, I mean, my internal connection to him didn't begin when I went to India. It was, obviously from the moment I was conscious of his name. So I didn't realize until I got older that I was, in a sense, already befriending him in my heart and bringing him into my life on an everyday basis. But it was so natural, I didn't think anything about it. I remember, I wanted to be an artist, so I remember just drawing Baba a lot. And I did a really beautiful piece when I was 13 years old that of his passport photo that looks like a photograph. It took me 30 days to do it, and I didn't want anybody to see me do it, so I did it in my room on the back of my door on a piece of poster board. But I remember, every stroke that I did, that, it was my way of connecting to him. Because, as a child, you don't have somebody sitting you down saying, okay, meditate and, focus in your heart, or, it's like, it was simple. If I was having a challenging day, I would say his name. Or if I, wanted to be close to him, I would draw him, or I would see the beauty of his face. It was like having it's anything you would do with a friend. If they're away somewhere and you want to think of them, you look at their picture and you might draw them. It's like that, simple.
Mm-hmm.
And then as I got older, life gets a little more challenging, and you have your suffering and you have your decisions to make. And so I would try to ask him, his advice inwardly. And I wouldn't always get a response, but I remember just daily trying to include him, on things like that. And then as I got a little older, I realized that my intuition was really a form of him speaking to me. And I had moments where he would come to me in dreams. I think the first time I dreamt of him, I was 14. And each one of these things, I think he was gently bringing me, from that experience in the beginning, where it's like a honeymoon, right? You have your beloved, you love your beloved, and you're in this beautiful embrace of him. And then once he knows that you're committed and that you're steadfast, then he starts giving you the tests.
Sounds like a bit of a game.
Yeah, I didn't know what I was getting into.
Well, you mentioned intuition, so let's segue to that. Baba had said in the discourses, I'm paraphrasing, but something like the previous cycle, the previous period was a transition for humanity from instinct to reason, and you can see that having played out with the Industrial Revolution and scientific advancement and all that. And then he said the current shift will be from reason to intuition. And when Don Stevens was in Mehrabad, Baba explained that every avatar gives a gift to humanity. Mm-hmm. And he gave examples of the different avatar gifts. Like he said, the gift of Jesus was love to humanity, and the gift of Muhammad was about how to live in tribal ways that were healthy and all this. And each avatar gave a gift. And he said, as Mayor Baba, my gift to humanity is that of intuition. And he explained to Don and everybody in Mandalay Hall at the time, it doesn't mean that before the gift nobody had intuition. Like before Jesus gave the gift of love, it doesn't mean nobody felt love, but that it was given more broadly, or made more available, or something was shifted around that quality. And we can see that in the world around Jesus, and we can see that now, I believe, in Mayor Baba's gift of intuition. But what do you feel that means? Because you mentioned intuition. What do you feel Baba's gift of intuition, or this shift that he says is happening from reason to intuition? Being a woman and being tuned into intuition, how do you feel that's going to play out for humanity at large?
There was a lot of questions.
I'm good at asking questions.
Okay, so first question would be in relation to perhaps my own intuition.
Sure.
And how that manifested.
Sure.
So, I think intuition was kind of a common term that, people, at least in the circles I was in, even somebody that wasn't even necessarily like spiritual or claimed to be, religious even, they would say, oh, use your intuition. And so it was a concept I think a lot of people know about. I think when Baba, talked about intuition, And then certainly it became kind of a big subject when Don was, really exploring it. Don Stevens, one of Baba's disciples. I, I didn't put a lot of weight on intuition until I realized that the voice was Baba. I mean, I thought, oh, this is just a tool or some faculty that humans have. But I didn't connect it to the fact that, wait, this is God's voice. And then, I think I really started actively building that muscle in my 30s. And then by the time I hit my 40s, it was like, wow, okay, am I going to actually listen to that voice? Because, you get to do that in-between stage where if you don't listen, then you're like, oh, shoot, I should have listened, and then you pay the price.
Yeah, we call that research and development.
Right. And so, as you start to flex the muscle, then, there's a type of receptiveness that's a part of that. And I realized that the more receptive I was to not just listening, but following the intuition, then there was a quickening of hearing more of my intuition and also being able to follow it immediately without question. Whereas before I would be in this dance with my mind, well, I should really do this because this is logical, But if you followed the intuition, oftentimes you would bypass that mental part, but it would be perfect. It would be the exact answer that you
Right. So logic can be much slower and still arrive at the same conclusion, but intuition might be in the present moment illogical but also true.
Right. So, I might use logic to say, oh, I might want to bring my umbrella outside today because it might rain. Whereas my intuition might say, take your umbrella, and then I wouldn't ask why because the intuition would say, but I wouldn't necessarily know if it was going to rain or not, and I certainly didn't wait around to do research. I just grabbed the umbrella and went out the door. And it would be small things like that.
Yeah, like the time I was driving down the road, it was after a Bible meeting, driving fast down the road home at 10 o'clock at night, and I heard my intuition say, you should slow down. And I slowed down, and right as I slowed down, a elk jumped right in front of my car. And if I hadn't slowed down, I definitely would have hit the elk. And I was slowed down enough that I could swerve around the elk, and I was like, my heart was pounding. I was like, oh my God, Baba just saved me from hitting the elk.
Wow.
And it felt to me like, well, if I disobeyed, I would have learned about my intuition. And if I obeyed, I'd learn about my intuition, because both are valuable lessons.
Right.
But one is a little more costly than the other.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. And I think that, as we mature in being receptive to that voice, then I think we hear messages from him that have much more meaning and significance